Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Called Shot, Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs, and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932, by Thomas Wolfe, narrated by Barry Abrams. Introduction. In the summer of 1932, at the beginning of the decade that would remake America, baseball fans were treated to one of the most remarkable seasons in the history of the sport. This book tells the story of that season. It was a pivotal time in the nation's history. After a decade of unparalleled ambition, greed, affluence, and self-indulgence, America was suffering from what historian William Leuchtenberg called the perils of prosperity. Unemployment rose. 1 in 4 Americans seeking work couldn't find a job. Wages dropped. Banks and privately owned businesses failed. The value of farm property plummeted. Construction of new homes declined. By the middle of the summer, more than 15,000 angry World War I veterans, calling themselves the Bonus Army, had marched into the nation's capital demanding an early payment of their veterans' bonuses. Abroad, there were similar economic problems and social disruption. In Europe, a rising young politician named Adolf Hitler placed second in the German presidential elections, receiving 37% of the vote. In this critical year, a presidential election year no less, Americans turned to baseball as a diversion. While other sporting events, horse races, boxing matches, tennis and golf tournaments, attracted attention, baseball was the national pastime, the only team sport that mattered. Many of the greats of the game were in their prime or nearing the end of their careers. The names of baseball luminaries like Ruth, Gehrig, Fox, Hornsby, Grove, McGraw, and McCarthy dominated the sports pages. 5 young pitchers, Dizzy Dean, Johnny Allen, Van Lingle Mungo, Lon Warneke, and Monty Weaver, would make dramatic contributions in their first full year in the big leagues. A former Major League star named Mark Koenig, toiling in the minor leagues, would be summoned back to the majors in August and play a key and controversial role in the heat of a pennant race. The major leagues consisted of 16 teams located in just 10 cities, none farther south than Washington, D.C., none farther west than St. Louis. 5 of those teams, the Yankees, Giants, Dodgers, Cubs, and White Sox, played in America's 2 biggest cities, New York and Chicago. The World Series would feature a clash between 2 iconic franchises, the New York Yankees and the Chicago Cubs. The city of Chicago would play an outsized role in the major events of 1932. Both presidential nominating conventions would be held in the city. Baseball's commissioner, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, would investigate and arbitrate from his offices in downtown Chicago. A pretty brunette, in love with a rookie shortstop, would shoot her lover in the Hotel Carlos, just a few blocks from Wrigley Field. And in October, Wrigley Field would be the setting for Babe Ruth's most famous home run. You didn't have to live in a big league city to be a fan or follow a favorite team. Ballpark attendance, which had slumped from 10.1 million in 1930 to 8.5 million in 1931, would fall again in 1932 to just under 7 million. Increasingly, fans relied on the radio to bring the game into their homes. The immediacy of radio broadcasts, more than summaries in the sports pages of daily newspapers, had the capacity to deliver the drama of each pitch, each at-bat, to those who could not attend games in person. The men and women who lived too far from major league cities to travel to games, the unemployed and poor who couldn't afford tickets, urban dwellers and rural farm families, the elderly, the sick, the young, even inmates in prison. In the National League, the defending champion St. Louis Cardinals and runner-up New York Giants would be challenged by the Brooklyn Dodgers, the Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Chicago Cubs. The Philadelphia Athletics in the American League, paced by the young slugger Jimmy Fox, were the odds-on favorite to win a 4th consecutive pennant, though Connie Mack expected his team to be challenged by the New York Yankees and the Washington Senators. The season did not lack for drama, on or off the field. A challenge to Babe Ruth's home run record, fist fights involving players and umpires, managerial dismissals, Allegations of gambling and judicial proceedings impacted the outcome of heated pennant races. This book begins by going back to another time when the nation was in crisis, the fall of 1918, when the baseball season was shortened by 1 month and the United States had become deeply involved in the war that raged in Europe. In 1918, the Boston Red Sox were playing the Chicago Cubs for the World Championship, and a young Red Sox pitcher was considered to be the key to the series. The pitcher's name was Babe Ruth. Prologue: A broken umbrella in a rainstorm. In all of baseball, there was nobody else like him. Babe Ruth was 23 years old, a young man with thick black hair, a large flat nose, and small eyes set in a round face. He was not handsome or especially graceful, but he was tall and husky, his strength packed into his torso and hips. Standing 6'2" and weighing more than 200 pounds, he was taller and bigger than most players of his era. He was engaging, boastful, and unknowable in the way that great public figures are often as inscrutable as their accomplishments. He gulped life like it was oxygen. He ate and drank with gusto. He smoked expensive cigars and bought fancy suits. Fans stood in line to buy tickets so they could watch him throw and hit a baseball. Reporters reveled in his company and wrote unabashedly about his prowess on the field. He exuded a distinctive boyish charm and innocence. Women adored him. This was Babe Ruth in the early fall of 1918, a young man who had mastered the art of living in the present. He didn't think about the past or worry about the future. For Ruth, life was an endless succession of glimmering moments, each to be indulged to the fullest. He was already the human embodiment of a decade that had not yet roared into existence. He was a man ahead of his time. On Monday evening, September 2nd, 1918, a train carrying Ruth and his Boston Red Sox teammates rolled out of New York City and tunneled into the darkness, moving west toward Chicago. 2 days after clinching the American League pennant, and just hours after a season-ending doubleheader against the Yankees at the Polo Grounds, the Red Sox players were exhausted and preoccupied. The Red Sox had played 6 games, 3 doubleheaders, over the previous 4 days of the regular season. The first game of the 1918 World Series against the Chicago Cubs was to be played in less than 48 hours. As the train rocked along on steel rails, Ruth played cards with his teammates. Everyone on the team knew that Ruth was a lousy card player, but even as he lost money, he was carefree. He laughed and joked with his teammates, predicting that his losses at the card table would bring the team good luck. His teammates didn't know much about Ruth's past. His boyhood was shrouded in mystery. The troubled early years on the streets of Baltimore, his removal from the family home at the age of 7 to go to St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, the extent of his boyhood under the guidance of Brother Matthias, the death of his mother, then his discovery by the scout Jack Dunn and his rapid rise to the major leagues. Near the end of the season, Ruth had suffered a personal loss. His father, George Ruth, had died in a brawl outside of the bar he owned in Baltimore. On Saturday afternoon, August 24th, the Babe had pitched the Red Sox to a 3-1 win over the St. Louis Browns at Fenway Park, his 12th of the season. That evening, the elder Ruth had been knocked down in an altercation with his wife's brother-in-law, striking his head on a curb. While the details were never clear, Ruth's father died a few hours later in a Baltimore hospital. When Ruth got the news on Sunday morning, he rushed to Baltimore. The funeral was held on Tuesday, and Ruth wept at the service. He had a younger sister, but he was not close to his blood relatives. Except for his teammates and his young first wife Helen, who was barely 20, he was alone. A few days after his father's funeral, Ruth rejoined the Red Sox. If he was still grieving from the emotional trauma of his father's death, it wasn't evident to his teammates. What his teammates did know was this: Ruth was an extraordinary baseball player. Although he was not yet a legend, he stood out among his peers. In 1915, his first full season in the major leagues, Ruth established himself as the best young pitcher in baseball. At age 20, he won 18 games and lost only 8. A year later, in 1916, he was 23-12, leading the league with an earned run average of 1.75 and setting a modern record for left-handed pitchers by hurling 9 shutouts. That season, Ruth faced Walter Johnson, the era's greatest pitcher, head-to-head on 5 occasions, winning the first 4 meetings and giving up only 2 runs in 37 innings of work. In addition to his pitching brilliance, Ruth was a menacing presence at the plate, especially against right-handed pitching. Ruth loved to hit the baseball. Prior to the 1918 season, Ruth made it clear to team owner Harry Frazee and new Red Sox manager Ed Barrow that he wanted to play every day in the outfield so he could hit more regularly. But when the season started, Barrow used him strictly as a pitcher. Finally, on May 6th, the manager inserted Ruth into the lineup as an outfielder to take advantage of his offensive talents. It was the first time in Ruth's major league career that he had played any position other than pitcher. Through the rest of the season, Barrow began to use Ruth more sparingly as a pitcher and to employ him occasionally both as an outfielder and first baseman. Ruth finished the regular season with a record of 13-7, and despite just having 317 at-bats, he tied for the league lead in home runs with 11. The power hitting was a harbinger of things to come. Ruth and his teammates had concerns that went beyond baseball. The entire season had been played under the cloud of World War I as American doughboys fought in the trenches of Europe, a war the nation entered a year earlier amid much public opposition and protest. Strict new laws had been enacted to ensure support for the war. Eugene Debs, a 3-time presidential candidate of the Socialist Party of America, was imprisoned for preaching his pacifist views and urging resistance to the draft. Baseball had been deeply affected by the conflict. Due to the war, the 1918 season was shortened by 5 weeks. Attendance at major league games declined 40%, from 5.2 million in 1917 to 3 million. Work or fight rules had been in effect since July 1st, requiring ballplayers between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for the draft. General Enoch Crowder, the provost marshal of the Army, was responsible for making sure that the selective service system operated smoothly and that young men of draft age were registered and ready to be called. Slacker raids rounded up draft dodgers. Teams in both leagues had been decimated as players had to choose either possible conscription or employment in vital war industries. Career minor leaguers were promoted to fill the roster spots vacated by players who were forced to take other jobs or join the military. Shipyards, munitions plants, and steel-producing factories actively recruited ball players to play for their company teams and signed them to contracts. Even Babe Ruth was forced to consider his options. In July, he flirted briefly with the notion of leaving the Red Sox to play in the Delaware River Shipbuilding League. He disappeared from Boston for a few days, saying that he would play in Pennsylvania for the Chester Shipyards team on July 4th. Ruth knew that other players were signing up with company teams to avoid being drafted, but his mid-season rebellion was primarily aimed at Boston's management, a reaction against its insistence that he continue in a primary role as a pitcher. Ruth's one-man strike was short-lived. Eventually, the Red Sox threatened legal action, and Ruth returned to Boston, agreeing to pitch whenever needed through the rest of the pennant race. Due to the abbreviated season, the World Series would be played a month earlier than usual. Wartime travel restrictions also impacted the scheduling of games. The first 3 games of the series were set for Chicago. The remaining games were to be played in Boston. Oddly enough, the Cubs owner Charles Weigman had arranged for the Chicago games to be played at Comiskey Park, the home of Chicago's American League team, the White Sox, because Comiskey Park had twice the seating capacity of Weigman Park. Weigman was willing to give away home field advantage for the chance to sell more tickets. The Red Sox train arrived in Chicago on a damp Tuesday afternoon. Manager Ed Barrow had scheduled a workout, but changed his mind and decided to let the players go directly to their hotel so they would have the remainder of the day to relax before playing the first game of the series on Wednesday afternoon. A line of cabs appeared to transport the Red Sox players through the streets of Chicago to the Hotel Metropole, a 7-story red brick and terracotta building located on the corner of Michigan Avenue and 23rd Street. The hotel had been designed by Chicago architect Clinton J. Warren in 1891, and in a few years it would become a famous Chicago landmark, notable as the headquarters for Al Capone, who kept a suite of offices in the hotel until 1928. On Wednesday, it rained. All morning a steady drizzle fell, and a chilling breeze blew the rain off Lake Michigan and into the city, threatening the start of Game 1. At mid-morning, Gary Herman, the president of the National Commission, called White Sox owner Charles Comiskey to inquire about the condition of the playing field. After Herman called to check on the field, Comiskey contacted the umpires and instructed them to go out to the park to take a look. A crowd of 100 or so hopeful fans stood outside the park, waiting in the rain for the ticket booths to open so they could purchase admission to the bleachers. Inside the structure, the infield was covered with a tarpaulin. Water pooled on the tarp and in the outfield. It was impossible to imagine the field would be ready for play by that afternoon. Comiskey and Herman conferred and decided the field was unplayable. The game was canceled. Posters were printed and tacked to buildings and poles in downtown Chicago announcing the postponement. The new schedule called for games to be played on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. The players were notified of the cancellation and had all day to kill time. Most of the Cubs players stayed home with their wives and families and drifted into regular routines. The Red Sox players, still drained from the long train ride, looked for something to do. Some of them napped in the hotel. Others played cards. A few went to the movies or braved the weather to go sightseeing in Chicago. For Babe Ruth, the postponement of the game was a window of opportunity. He liked Chicago. Ruth called local sports writer Harry Hochstatter and asked if he wanted to go out on the town. Hochstatter was a good-natured man, a perfect companion for the young ballplayer. Hochstatter had an interest in all sports, but mainly covered boxing and horse racing for the Chicago Evening Post. In particular, Hochstatter liked to drink and gamble. A dozen years later, on his deathbed in a Chicago hospital, Hochstatter would beg a nurse to do him a favor. As a last request, he asked the nurse to go out and make a wager for him on a horse race. Hochstatter was more than happy to spend a rainy day carousing and drinking with Ruth. The two men made plans to meet. At 3:11 p.m. on that wet and quiet afternoon, a bomb exploded outside the Federal Building in downtown Chicago at the corner of Adams and Dearborn. The blast ripped a hole in an 18-inch thick wall, spewing bricks, mortar, wood, marble, and glass in all directions. Windows were blown out in the nearby Edison building. A flying radiator struck and killed a horse in the street. Ambulances and police vans screamed down Dearborn Street. A crowd gathered and discovered 4 mangled bodies in the wreckage. One of the victims was a young woman named Ella Milka, the daughter of a wealthy contractor. She was on her way into the post office to mail a letter. A young sailor, who worked as a messenger at the Navy Intelligence Bureau, died on the steps outside the Federal Building. 2 postal employees, one inside the building and one outside, died instantly when the bomb detonated. A 16-year-old postal worker, Walt Disney, was in the lobby of the building when the blast occurred and barely escaped serious injury. More than 30 other people were injured by the flying debris. Eyewitness accounts varied. A woman claimed that she saw a man run up the steps of the building carrying a cigar box with a fuse. According to her, the man was smoking a cigar and touched the cigar to the end of the fuse, then kicked the box under a circular radiator and raced back down the steps. Another witness reported seeing 2 men drive up in a red Stutz automobile. One of the men wore a brown felt hat, the other a Panama hat. Just before the explosion, one man scampered up the steps of the building, then rushed back down and jumped into a car that zoomed off down Clark Street. the police suspected that the attack was the work of someone associated with the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, or its sympathizers. More than 100 members of that organization had been tried in the sixth-floor courtroom of the federal building during the spring and summer, accused under the Espionage Act of interfering with the war effort and conspiring to hinder draft registration. A white-haired federal judge named Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a native of Indiana, had been on the bench for the trial. Landis, appointed to the federal judiciary by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1905, had a reputation as a tough judge with fortitude and uncompromising integrity. In less than 2 years, Landis would be appointed to an even more prestigious position. In 1920, he would become the first commissioner of Major League Baseball, replacing Gary Herman as the administrative boss of the game. Landis would be the man entrusted with overseeing the investigation into the alleged plot to fix the 1919 World Series and restoring trust in the fairness of the national pastime. The IWW trial had ended in August with convictions of all the defendants, including IWW leader Big Bill Hayward. Judge Landis sentenced Hayward and other top leaders of the organization to 20 years in Leavenworth, the stiffest possible penalty. On the day of the bombing, most of the IWW leaders were in the Cook County Jail awaiting transfer to the federal facility, but Hayward happened to be in the federal building, just 2 floors above Judge Landis's courtroom. He was dictating to his secretary, Mary Service, in the United States Marshal's office. Hayward had little response to the explosion, except to say, "I suppose the IWW will be blamed. We have been blamed for many things." Given the timing of the bombing and the location, the police speculated that perhaps it was an assassination attempt on Judge Landis. As it turned out, the judge was on vacation in Allenson, Michigan. Landis responded with characteristic calm. "The news of the explosion comes as a surprise," he said. "I have no reason to suspect an IWW plot or to blame the organization or any of its members for the outrage." That evening, the Chicago police and United States Secret Service agents went into action. More than 1,500 law enforcement officials combed through the city of Chicago, knocking on doors, asking questions, and making arrests. Witnesses were interviewed. Dozens of people were dragged out of their homes and apartments, shoved into police vans, and escorted to police stations for interrogation. At the corner of Dearborn and Adams, laborers worked to remove the rubble. The rain finally ended. Shovels clicked against the street throughout the night. Although a swarm of reporters descended on downtown Chicago after the bombing at the federal building, it is unlikely that Hochstatter or Ruth heard the news until that evening. Even if they had known, it is doubtful that the explosion would have derailed their plans. Hochstatter and Ruth celebrated all day. Full-fledged prohibition was less than a year away, and more than half of the counties in Illinois were already dry. But no law was going to force the closure of drinking establishments in Chicago. That evening, the two men rolled into a crowded party at a hotel suite. Ruth was alert and apparently unfazed by the day's adventure. Hochstatter was too drunk to stand up. He collapsed onto a couch. A motley collection of writers and professional gamblers clustered around a steel washtub filled with ice and bottles of wine. One of the writers was Gene Fowler, a tall, loose-limbed man with big features, who had been hired by the New York American to report on the World Series. Fowler had grown up on the streets of Denver and found a home in newspaper work, rising to the position of city editor of the Rocky Mountain News by his mid-20s. Like many of the reporters of his era, he worked hard, wrote fast, and liked to hang out with athletes and eccentrics of any type. He pushed his way across the room to Hochstatter's couch. Fowler had been trying to locate Hochstatter and Ruth earlier in the day. Failing to do so, he dropped by Comiskey Park in the afternoon. It must have been around the time the bomb went off at Dearborn and Adams, and visited with Charles Comiskey in his private quarters. Comiskey offered the reporter a drink and something to eat. They watched the rain fall on the sodden field. Comiskey told Fowler stories about his youth and his experiences driving a brick wagon. Hochstatter was too inebriated for meaningful dialogue, so Fowler struck up a conversation with Ruth. He asked Ruth if he thought he'd be able to pitch the next day. Ruth smacked Fowler on the back, a blow strong enough to knock a lesser man to the floor. "I'll pitch 'em all if they say the word," Ruth bellowed. If Ruth knew he was going to be the Red Sox starting pitcher in Game 1, he didn't let on. His thoughts were elsewhere. Ruth told Fowler he had an appointment later that evening with a young woman, and the reporter surmised that the pitcher would spend the rest of the night drinking and socializing. A few minutes later, Ruth left the party and disappeared into the night. The skies finally cleared. Thursday morning was cool and sunny. At Comiskey Park, fans began lining up outside ticket windows early in the morning. A police wagon appeared a short while later, and officers jumped out to arrest 6 men involved in a craps game. Red Sox players were on the field 2 hours before game time to warm up and take batting practice. Ruth stepped into the batter's box to take his swings. He couldn't have slept more than a few hours the night before, if at all, but Ruth stroked the first batting practice pitch into the right field bleachers. He showed no signs of fatigue from the previous day's activities. Neither manager tipped his hand about who would be his starting pitcher. The Cubs manager was Fred Mitchell. Oddly enough, Mitchell had stronger ties to Boston than to Chicago. Born and raised in Massachusetts, Mitchell had started his career with the Boston Americans and appeared in the franchise's first game, coming in to relieve the starter, Cy Young. In the offseason, Mitchell lived just outside of Boston on a small farm with an apple orchard. He was reserved, studious, and intelligent, a keen observer of the game. He was confident the Cubs were the better ball club and that his team would win the series. Mitchell was worried about Babe Ruth's bat, but Ruth was supposedly vulnerable to left-handed pitching, and Mitchell had 2 good left-handers to use against the Red Sox, Hippo Vaughn and Lefty Tyler. Mitchell did not tell the press which of the 2 pitchers would start Game 1. He had both Vaughn and Tyler warm up prior to the game. Ed Barrow was also coy about his strategy. About 30 minutes before game time, Barrow sent Joe Bush to the bullpen to warm up for the Red Sox. But a couple minutes later, Ruth joined him and started throwing too. It wasn't until the managers exchanged scorecards at home plate that the lineups were set. Vaughn was designated as the Cubs starter. Barrow listed Ruth as his starting pitcher, batting him in the number 9 spot in the order. The official attendance was announced as 19,274, a disappointing crowd for the opening game of the series. Vaughn retired the Red Sox easily in the top half of the first inning. When Babe Ruth walked to the mound to warm up, he glanced at the half-filled stands. Ruth noticed rows of empty seats in the upper decks. Most fans were quietly scattered throughout the lower deck. Many of the men wore white straw hats, a fashion statement indicating that it was still summer. The Red Sox team that took the field behind Ruth was one of the weakest in World Series history. Of the infielders, Fred Thomas at third, Everett Scott at shortstop, Dave Sheehan at second, and Stuffy McInnis at first, only McInnis was a reliable batter. Thomas was a rookie with only 147 Major League at-bats. Sheehan was a lifetime .230 hitter. Scott had batted .221 during the season. In the outfield, Harry Hooper was a solid hitter and destined for the Hall of Fame, but Amos Strunk in center field had batted a career-low .257 in 1918. At this point in his career, Ruth thought of left field as his natural position, but Barrow wanted him to pitch, and that meant George Whiteman was in the lineup as the left fielder. Whiteman was 35 years old, a career minor leaguer. Before the 1918 season, he had a total of 43 Major League at-bats. If not for the war and the work or fight rules, Whiteman would have had to pay admission to get into a Major League ballpark. He was slow in the outfield and ineffective at the plate. In 71 games, he had collected just 57 hits. In the bottom of the first inning, Ruth quickly retired the first 2 Cubs batters. Then, Les Mann, the Cubs left fielder, hit a ball that bounced off a small stone and scooted into the outfield. A couple of pitches later, Mann stole second. Doda Paskert hit a line drive to left that dropped in front of Whiteman and caromed off his.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?